Millionaire refused help. Until the nurse showed her unit, tattoo, the blood, and the badge. The VIP wing of St. Jude's Hospital did not smell like sickness. It smelled of money. The air was filtered through lavender-infused purifiers, and the floors were polished to a mirror sheen that reflected the distress of the wealthy. For Julian Sterling, this sanitized luxury was a cage. Julian paced the length of the private suite, the leather soles of his Italian shoes clicking rhythmically against the marble like the ticking of a doomsday clock. He was a man carved from granite and tailored wool, wearing a beige suit that cost more than the annual salary of the staff scurrying in the hallway. But beneath the crisp, unbuttoned white shirt, his chest was tight, constricted by a fear he refused to name. In the bed, small and pale against the mountain of white pillows, lay Leo, his 8-year-old son. Leo wasn't sleeping, he was fading. A mysterious autoimmune flare-up, the doctors said. Stress-induced, the psychologists whispered. Julian didn't deal in whispers. He dealt in acquisitions, mergers, and hostile takeovers. He fixed things, but he couldn't fix this. "I don't care about hospital protocols, Roberts," Julian's voice boomed, shattering the hushed atmosphere of the suite. He spun around to face Dr. Roberts, the chief of staff, a man whose hands were shaking slightly. "My son has been here for 3 days. His fever is spiking again. If you people are incompetent, tell me, and I'll fly in a team from Zurich within the hour." "Mr. Sterling, please," Dr. Roberts pleaded, adjusting his glasses. "We are doing everything. The medication needs time to—" "Time is the one asset I am losing," Julian roared. In a blind fit of impotent rage, Julian swept his arm across the side table. A heavy crystal vase, filled with get-well hydrangeas from a board member, went airborne. It crashed against the wall, shattering into 1,000 glittering shards. Silence fell over the room. Even the heart monitor seemed to skip a beat. Julian gasped, looking down. In his fury, he hadn't just cleared the table. He had caught his hand on the jagged edge of the breaking crystal. A deep, ugly gash ran across his palm, slicing through the lifeline. The blood was immediate and bright red, welling up and dripping onto the pristine floor. Drip, drip, drip. "Mr. Sterling, you're injured," a young nurse near the door gasped, rushing forward with a handful of gauze. Julian recoiled as if she were infectious. He held his bleeding hand to his chest, his face twisting into a sneer of pure arrogance. "Don't touch me," he snapped, backing away until he hit the edge of the medical exam table. He sat down heavily, the adrenaline leaving him dizzy. "I don't want a junior nurse. I want a surgeon. Get someone who knows what they are doing." The room froze. The staff was paralyzed by his hostility. He was bleeding profusely, staining his beige trousers, yet his pride stood like a fortress wall. Then, the door swung open. There was no hesitation in the footsteps that entered. They were heavy, deliberate, and fast. Sarah Miller walked in. She wasn't part of the VIP concierge team. She was from the trauma unit downstairs, called up because they were short-staffed on a break. She didn't look like the polished dolls of the VIP wing. Her blue scrubs were practical, worn at the seams. Her brown hair was pulled back in a severe, no-nonsense knot. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't apologize for the interruption. She saw the blood, she saw the shock, and she moved. "Clear the room," Sarah ordered. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried a frequency of command that made Dr. Roberts and the other nurses instinctively step back. "I said get a surgeon," Julian barked, though his voice was wavering as the room began to spin. "Who do you think you—" Sarah ignored him. She stepped into his personal space, invaded his bubble of wealth, and grabbed his wrist. Her grip was iron. It wasn't the tentative touch of a caregiver afraid of a lawsuit. It was the vice-like grip of someone who had held men together while the world exploded around them. "Sit still," she said, her eyes locking onto his. They were hazel, flecked with gold, and utterly fearless. "You've severed a superficial vein. You're going to bleed out over your Italian loafers if you don't shut up and let me work." Julian opened his mouth to fire her, to scream, to assert his dominance. He looked down at his hand, wrapped in the thick, bloody bandage she was rapidly applying. The bright hospital lights washed over them. And then he saw it. As Sarah worked, reaching across him to grab a suture kit from the tray, the sleeve of her scrub top rode up. There, inked into the pale skin of her upper left arm, was a tattoo. It was detailed, monochromatic, and undeniable. A skull, crossed rifles, and the text that punched the air out of Julian's lungs. Operation Phantom Fury Fallujah. The world stopped. The sterile hum of the hospital vanished. For a second, Julian wasn't in a VIP suite. He was back in the dust and the heat. He was a 22-year-old lieutenant, pinned down in a hellscape, radio screaming for medevac, watching the sky for angels. That unit, her unit, had been the one to pull his platoon out of the fire. They were the ghosts who walked through walls to save the dying. Julian's face went slack. His mouth hung slightly open, the arrogance draining away to reveal the terrified, traumatized boy beneath the millionaire's skin. He stared at the ink, then up at her face. He saw the faint white scar running through her eyebrow. He saw the way she positioned her body, shielding the patient, checking the exits, efficient, lethal, protective. She wasn't a servant. She was a warrior. "You," Julian whispered, his voice cracking. The fight left his body. He slumped on the exam table, surrendering his hand to her completely. Phantom fury. Sarah didn't look up from his wound. She tightened the bandage with a precise, practiced jerk that made him wince. "3rd Battalion. We cleaned up the mess." She looked him in the eye then, pausing for just a second. She recognized the look in his eyes, the 1,000-yard stare. She nodded, a microscopic acknowledgement of shared horror. "Now hold this pressure, sir. I'm going to stitch you up." Julian didn't argue. He didn't demand the chief surgeon. He sat in silence, watching the woman who had likely walked through the same valley of death he had, stitching his skin back together with hands that had seen more war than his entire board of directors combined. The silent salute. 3 days later, the silence of the Sterling estate was broken by the sound of a beat-up Ford truck crunching up the gravel driveway. It looked like a rusted scar against the pristine landscaping of the manor. Julian stood on the balcony of his master suite, watching. He held a tumbler of amber whiskey, though it was only noon. Below, Sarah Miller stepped out of the truck. She had a duffel bag thrown over one shoulder and a medical kit in the other hand. She paused, looking up at the colossal limestone mansion not with awe, but with a tactical assessment. She was checking sightlines. Julian had discharged Leo against medical advice. Or rather, he had moved the hospital to the house. But he had made one stipulation. He didn't want the agency nurses. He wanted her. He had offered her triple her salary. She had refused. He offered to pay off her mortgage. She accepted. He watched her walk to the front door. He felt a strange sensation in his chest. Relief. Inside the house, the atmosphere changed within hours. The Sterling estate was a cold place, a museum of expensive artifacts where a child wasn't allowed to touch anything. Leo's room was at the end of the east wing, isolated. Julian stayed in his study, attempting to work, but his eyes kept drifting to the security monitors. He watched Sarah enter Leo's room. The boy was sitting up in bed, staring at a tablet, looking miserable and small. Most nurses cooed at him. Most nurses treated him like glass. Sarah threw her bag in the corner. "All right, trooper," she said, her voice clear on the audio feed. "Report." Leo looked up, startled. "What?" "I said report," Sarah said, walking over and opening the heavy velvet curtains, letting blinding sunlight flood the gloomy room. "Name, rank, and current status." Leo blinked, confused but intrigued. "I'm Leo. Leo is a zodiac sign. It's not a rank," Sarah said, hands on her hips. She wasn't smiling, but her eyes were warm. "In this unit, you are Cadet Sterling. My name is Doc. We have a mission to get you back on your feet. Do you copy?" Leo sat up straighter. "I copy." "Good. First mission, we don't eat in bed. It's bad for morale. We eat at the table." Julian watched, mesmerized, as Sarah ignored the wheelchair in the corner. She offered Leo her arm. She didn't carry him. She supported him. She forced him to use his atrophied muscles. Left, right, left, right. Good form, cadet. For the first time in months, Julian saw a spark of life in his son's eyes. It wasn't the pampering he was used to. It was a challenge, and Leo was rising to it. As the weeks bled into a month, the magic of the nurse became undeniable. It wasn't medical magic. It was the magic of presence. Julian observed from the periphery, a ghost in his own castle. He saw the changes. The house, usually silent as a tomb, began to have noises. He heard Sarah singing in the kitchen, not classical opera, but old classic rock, humming along while she prepared high-protein meals that didn't look like hospital sludge. One evening, late, a thunderstorm rolled in. The power flickered and died. The mansion was plunged into darkness. Julian's PTSD had always hated the dark. It brought back the caves, the waiting. He sat in his study, gripping the arms of his leather chair, sweat beading on his forehead, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. A soft knock on the doorframe startled him. A beam of tactical light cut through the room, not pointed at his face, but at the ceiling, illuminating the room with a soft, diffused glow. "Generator takes 90 seconds to kick in," Sarah's voice came from the dark. "Figured you might want a status check." She walked in, placing a battery-operated lantern on his desk. She didn't ask if he was okay. She didn't ask why a grown billionaire was trembling in the dark. She knew. "Leo is asleep," she said softly. "He slept through the thunder." "Brave kid." Julian exhaled, a long, shuddering breath. He reached for the bottle of whiskey on his desk and poured 2 glasses. He pushed one across the mahogany toward her. "Sit," he commanded. It wasn't an order. It was a plea. Sarah hesitated, then pulled up a chair. She sat with perfect posture, taking the glass. "You were 3rd Battalion," Julian said, his voice rough. "Fallujah, November 2004. Sarah took a sip, the amber liquid catching the lantern light. "Yes. We were attached to the assault element. Triage in the filth. I was 1st Marines," Julian admitted, the confession hanging heavy in the air. "We were pinned down near the cemetery. We took heavy casualties. If your unit hadn't cleared the route for the extract..." He trailed off, his hand unconsciously rubbing the scar on his shoulder hidden beneath his suit jacket. "You don't have to say it," Sarah said. Her voice dropped an octave, losing its professional edge, becoming raw and human. "We all left pieces of ourselves there, Julian." It was the first time she had used his first name. "It stripped away the billions of dollars, the estate, the title." "I don't know how to do this," Julian whispered, looking at the door where his son slept down the hall. "I can lead a company. I can run a conglomerate. But him? I look at him and I see how fragile he is, and I'm terrified I'm going to break him, so I stay away." Sarah leaned forward. She reached out, not to hold his hand, but to tap her finger on the desk, demanding his attention. "He isn't fragile, sir. He's your son. He has your blood. He's tough. But a soldier can't fight without a commanding officer to look up to. You're AWOL. You need to return to the front line." Julian looked at her, really looked at her. In the dim lantern light, she was beautiful. Not in the way his socialite girlfriends were beautiful, all makeup and mirrors. She was beautiful, like a forged blade, sharp, reliable, and enduring. "Teach me," Julian said. "Teach me how to come back." Sarah smiled, a genuine, soft smile that reached her eyes. "Roger that. Training starts at 600. We're making pancakes, and you're mixing the batter." For the first time in 10 years, the knot of anxiety in Julian's chest loosened. He wasn't alone in the foxhole anymore, but he didn't know that the enemy was already flanking him, preparing to strike from the one direction he wasn't watching: his past life. The perimeter breach. The truce lasted for 3 weeks. In that time, the Sterling estate had transformed from a mausoleum into a home. There was flour on the kitchen island from Saturday morning pancakes. There were toy soldiers deployed along the grand staircase banister. And most dangerously, there was laughter. Julian had begun to leave the office early, drawn by the strange magnetic pull of domestic normalcy. He had even learned to mix Leo's medication without his hands shaking. Then, the perimeter was breached. It happened on a Tuesday. A sleek, silver Porsche 911 tore up the driveway, scattering the gravel that Sarah had carefully raked that morning. Vanessa Belmont stepped out, Julian's fiancée. She had been in Paris for Fashion Week, which, for her, usually lasted 2 months. She was a vision of sharp angles and expensive silk, beautiful in the way a diamond is beautiful. Cold, hard, and capable of cutting glass. She swept into the foyer, dropping her Hermes bags for the staff to collect. "Julian, darling, the house smells like grease." She wrinkled her nose, her eyes scanning the room until they landed on the scene in the living room. Julian was on the floor. He was building a Lego fortress with Leo. Sarah was sitting on the sofa nearby folding laundry, but she and Julian were sharing a look, a private, comfortable smile over a joke Leo had just made. Vanessa froze. The air in the room dropped 10 degrees. She didn't see a father bonding with his son. She saw a replacement. She saw a woman in cheap scrubs sitting on her future furniture, looking at her future husband with a level of understanding Vanessa had never achieved in 3 years of engagement. "Vanessa!" Julian stood up, brushing off his knees, looking suddenly awkward in his own home. "You're back early." "Evidently," she said, her voice like ice water. She walked over and kissed his cheek, marking her territory, then turned her gaze to Sarah. "And you must be the help. The agency said you were temporary." "I'm the medical caregiver, ma'am," Sarah said, standing up. She didn't salute, but her posture straightened into the at-ease stance of a soldier facing a hostile officer. "Well, you can take your break now." Vanessa dismissed her with a wave of her manicured hand. "We have family matters to discuss." Over the next 2 days, the atmosphere in the house grew toxic. Vanessa was a master of psychological warfare. She didn't attack Sarah directly in front of Julian. Instead, she planted seeds. "She's too familiar with Leo, Julian. It's unhealthy attachment. Did you check her background thoroughly? I saw her staring at the safe. She brings that war energy into the house. It's too dark for a child." Julian tried to brush it off, but the seeds found purchase in the cracks of his old paranoia. He was a man used to people wanting his money. He was a man who had built walls to survive. On Friday evening, the trap was sprung. Julian was hosting a small dinner for 2 board members. He needed everything to be perfect. As he dressed in the master suite, Vanessa burst in, frantic. "It's gone, Julian, my Patek Philippe, the diamond one. I left it on the vanity while I showered." Julian frowned, buttoning his cuffs. "You probably misplaced it, Van. Check the drawer." "I did! I've looked everywhere." She was hyperventilating, tears welling up in her eyes. The only person who was upstairs in the last hour was her. That nurse. I saw her coming out of our room with towels. Julian's stomach dropped. Sarah wouldn't steal. "Wouldn't she?" Vanessa hissed, grabbing his arm. "She's a grunt, Julian. She probably makes in a year what that watch costs. Desperation makes people do ugly things. Just check her bag. If I'm wrong, I'll apologize." Julian felt the old, cold armor sliding back over his heart. He walked downstairs, the sound of his footsteps heavy and ominous. He found Sarah in the kitchen, preparing Leo's evening meds. "Sarah," Julian said. His voice was devoid of the warmth it had held for weeks. It was the voice of the CEO again. "Bring your bag to the study, now." Sarah paused, sensing the shift in atmospheric pressure. She looked at him, confused, but nodded. "Yes, sir." In the study, with Vanessa standing behind Julian like a vengeful shadow, Sarah placed her worn canvas duffel on the mahogany desk. "Open it," Julian commanded. "Sir?" "Just open the damn bag, Sarah." Sarah unzipped it. It contained a change of clothes, a book, a bottle of water, and her stethoscope. Julian reached in, his heart pounding, praying to find nothing. He pushed aside the scrubs. There, tucked into the side pocket, glinting under the desk lamp, was the diamond watch. The silence that followed was louder than an explosion. Sarah stared at the watch, her face going pale. She looked at Vanessa, who wore a mask of shocked victimhood, and then at Julian. She saw the look in his eyes. It wasn't just anger. It was devastation. He looked like he had been shot by friendly fire. "I didn't take this," Sarah said quietly. Her voice was steady, but her hands were clenched at her sides. "You know I didn't take this." "It's in your bag!" Vanessa shrieked. "Julian, call the police!" Julian held up a hand to silence Vanessa. He looked at Sarah, his eyes dead. The trust was shattered. He had let her in, and his paranoia screamed that he had been a fool. The mercenary nature of the world had won again. "Get out," Julian whispered. "Julian, listen to me." "I said get out," he roared, slamming his hand on the desk. "You're fired. You have 10 minutes to vacate the premises. If you're not gone, I call the cops." Sarah looked at him for a long, agonizing second. She saw the PTSD, the fear, the walls slamming shut. She realized there was no tactical maneuver to win this battle. The enemy had successfully flanked her. "Understood," she said softly. She didn't beg. She didn't cry. She zipped up her bag, slung it over her shoulder, and turned around. As she walked to the front door, Leo appeared at the top of the stairs, rubbing his eyes. "Doc, where are you going?" Sarah stopped. Her chin trembled for the first time. She looked up at the boy. "I have a new mission, cadet. You hold the fort down here." "No!" Leo shouted, realizing what was happening. He started to run down the stairs. "Dad, don't let her go! Dad!" Julian stepped out of the study, grabbing Leo by the arm as the boy tried to run to Sarah. "Go to your room, Leo!" "No, she's my friend! Doc!" Leo screamed, fighting against his father's grip. Sarah opened the heavy oak door. She paused one last time, looking back at Julian holding his screaming son. She offered a single, sharp nod, a final salute to a fallen comrade, and walked out into the cold night. The door clicked shut, severing the lifeline. The casualty of silence. The house didn't just go quiet after Sarah left. It died. 48 hours. That was all it took for the fragile ecosystem they had built to collapse. The first night, Leo refused to eat. He locked his door and barricaded it with the very Lego fortress he and Julian had built. By the second morning, the silence from his room was replaced by a hacking, wet cough that echoed through the halls like a death knell. Julian paced the hallway, a ghost in his own home. Vanessa was delighted, chirping about redecorating the guest room and hiring a proper governess from a Swiss agency, someone with class. Her voice grated on Julian's nerves like sandpaper. "He's just acting out, darling," Vanessa said, sipping an espresso in the kitchen. "He needs discipline, not a playmate." "He needs to breathe, Vanessa," Julian snapped, his eyes bloodshot. He hadn't slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Sarah's face. Not angry, but disappointed. That stoic acceptance of his betrayal haunted him more than any scream would have. Suddenly, a crash came from upstairs. Julian dropped his coffee mug and sprinted up the stairs, taking them 2 at a time. He burst into Leo's room. Leo was on the floor, tangled in his bedsheets. He was burning up. His skin was gray, his lips tinged with blue. He was gasping for air, his small chest heaving uselessly. "Leo!" Julian fell to his knees, gathering his son into his arms. The boy was scorching hot. "Doc!" Leo wheezed, his eyes rolling back. "I want... Doc! Call 911!" Julian screamed down the hallway, panic seizing his throat. "Vanessa, call the ambulance!" Chaos erupted. Paramedics arrived. Sirens wailed. Leo was stabilized but critical, his vitals crashing due to extreme stress-induced shock. They hooked him up to machines in his room because moving him was deemed too risky. Hours later, the house was a field hospital again. Beeping monitors, hushed whispers. But this time there was no Sarah to command the room. There was only Julian, sitting by the bed, holding Leo's limp hand, watching the heart rate monitor flicker erratically. He needed Leo's medical logs. The new agency nurse had asked for the history of his last dosage. Julian ran to his study, his mind a fog of terror. He began tearing through the drawers, looking for the logbook Sarah kept. He couldn't find it. He checked the safe. He checked the shelves. In his frantic search, his elbow bumped the mouse of his computer, waking the screensaver. The security system interface popped up. Julian paused. He stared at the screen. A thought, dark and sickening, clawed at the back of his mind. Check the perimeter. It was Sarah's voice in his head. Always check your six. His hands trembling, Julian pulled up the archive footage from Friday evening. Camera 04, the hallway outside the master's suite, timestamp 1842. He clicked play. On the high-definition screen, the truth played out in black and white. He saw Sarah walk into the master suite carrying fresh towels. She was in the room for 30 seconds. She came out empty-handed, moving efficiently toward the linen closet. 2 minutes later, Vanessa appeared. She looked around the hallway, checking for witnesses. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the diamond watch. She smirked. A cold, ugly expression Julian had never seen before. She walked over to where Sarah's bag was sitting on the hall table, where she had left it to carry the towels. Unzipped it, shoved the watch deep inside, and zipped it back up. Julian watched the footage. He watched it again. The breath left his body. He felt a physical blow to his gut, stronger than any shrapnel. He hadn't been protecting his family. He had invited the enemy inside and exiled the soldier who was guarding them. He saw his own cowardice reflected in the screen. He had let his money and his paranoia dictate his loyalty. He had chosen the engagement ring over the combat badge. "Oh God," Julian whispered, covering his mouth. "What have I done?" He stood up, knocking his chair over. He needed to find her. He needed to fix this. But he didn't even know where she lived. He had the agency file, but that was just data. He began tearing the study apart again, looking for anything she might have left behind. He found a blue notebook tucked behind the row of medical journals on the bottom shelf. It wasn't the official medical log. It was a personal notebook, labeled Operation Leo. Julian opened it. It wasn't full of medical jargon. It was full of observations. Entry 1. The cadet loves strawberries but hates the texture. Blend them. Entry 14. Julian, Dad, watches from the balcony. He wants to come down but is scared. Strategy. Leave Lego pieces on the coffee table to lure him in. Entry 20. Leo asked about his mom today, told him she's a star in the sky. He needs his father to tell him stories about her. Note to self. Encouraging Julian to talk about her is the next mission objective. Entry 32. The house is cold. Julian is suffering. He has the same eyes as the boys in Fallujah. He needs forgiveness, not just profit. He's a good man buried under a lot of armor. Julian read the words through a blur of tears. She hadn't been stealing from him. She had been studying him, trying to heal him, trying to bridge the gap between him and his son. She had cared for him when he was unlovable. He slammed the notebook shut and stood up. The grief transmuted into a cold, hard resolve. The Marine was back. He walked out of the study and found Vanessa in the living room, looking at fabric swatches. "Vanessa," Julian said. His voice was terrifyingly calm. "Yes, darling? Is Leo quiet?" "Pack your bags," Julian said. "Excuse me?" She laughed nervously. "We're going to the Hamptons next week. I haven't even—" "You have 10 minutes," Julian interrupted, stepping into her space. "I saw the tape." Vanessa's face went white. The swatch book dropped from her hands. "Julian, I did it for us. She was—" "Get out of my house," Julian said, pointing to the door, "before I forget that I'm a gentleman and throw you out myself." Vanessa fled. The door slammed. Julian didn't wait. He ran to the garage. He bypassed the Rolls-Royce and the Bentley. He went to the back, pulling the tarp off an old, dusty vehicle he hadn't driven in years. A vintage Land Rover Defender. Rugged. Capable. He threw the notebook onto the passenger seat. He grabbed his keys. Leo was fighting for his life upstairs, and the only medicine that could save him was somewhere in the city, living in a world Julian had spent a decade trying to forget. "Hang on, Leo," Julian whispered, revving the engine until it roared. "Reinforcements are inbound." Mission accomplished. The GPS on the dashboard of the Land Rover Defender glowed with a singular destination, a blue line cutting through the arterial bleeding of the city traffic. Julian drove with a focus he hadn't possessed since his extraction from the Ar Ramadi district. The luxury of the Sterling estate faded in the rearview mirror, replaced by the grimy, industrial sprawl of the South Side. The rain had turned into a deluge, drumming against the metal roof of the Defender like shrapnel. Julian's hands were white-knuckled on the steering wheel. On the passenger seat, the blue notebook, Operation Leo, sat like a sacred text. Every time he glanced at it, a fresh wave of shame washed over him. He had fired the only person who had ever tried to save him from himself. He pulled up to the address listed in the agency file. It wasn't an apartment complex. It was a converted warehouse with a sign hanging askew above the chain-link fence, Veterans Outreach and Community Garden. Julian killed the engine. The silence inside the cab was deafening. He was wearing a $3,000 suit that was now rumpled and stained with coffee, but for the first time in years, he didn't care about the image. He cared about the objective. He stepped out into the rain. The water soaked him instantly, plastering his expensive shirt to his skin. He pushed through the rusted gate. In the center of the muddy yard, under a makeshift tarp shelter, a figure was working. Sarah. She was on her knees in the dirt, aggressively pulling weeds from a planter box. She wasn't wearing scrubs. She was in a gray hoodie and cargo pants, her hair soaked, looking like she was fighting the earth itself. Julian approached slowly. He didn't want to startle her. He knew better than to sneak up on a vet. "You're planting winter vegetables," Julian said, his voice struggling to be heard over the rain. "Roots run deep." Sarah froze. Her shoulders tensed, that familiar combat readiness locking into place. She didn't turn around immediately. She wiped her muddy hands on her pants and stood up slowly, turning to face him. Her face was guarded, her eyes hard flint. "Mr. Sterling, you're a long way from the VIP lounge." "I'm not here as Mr. Sterling," Julian said, stepping under the edge of the tarp. Water dripped from his nose and chin. "I'm here as Leo's father, and I'm here as a man who made a catastrophic error in judgment." Sarah crossed her arms. "If you're here to accuse me of stealing something else, save it. I don't have anything left to take." "I know you didn't take it," Julian said, his voice cracking. "I saw the tape, Sarah. I saw Vanessa plant it. She's gone. I kicked her out." Sarah's expression didn't soften. The betrayal had cut too deep. "That's good for you, but it doesn't change the fact that when the chips were down, you didn't trust your squad. You trusted the enemy because she looked pretty in a dress." "You're right," Julian admitted. He didn't offer excuses. He didn't try to buy her forgiveness. He reached into his jacket pocket, but instead of a checkbook, he pulled out the blue notebook. Sarah's eyes widened slightly when she saw it. "I read it," Julian said, holding Operation Leo out to her. Entry 32. "You said I was a good man buried under armor. You were wrong, Doc. The armor wasn't protecting me. It was suffocating me, and it was suffocating my son." He took a step closer, invading her personal space, but this time with humility, not arrogance. "Leo is in critical condition," Julian said, the desperation finally breaking through his voice. "He's crashed. He's asking for you. The doctors are talking about sedation, about ventilators. I can buy the hospital, Sarah, but I can't buy what you give him. I can't buy the will to live." Sarah looked at the notebook, then at Julian's face. She saw the fear in his eyes, the same fear she had seen in the eyes of young privates bleeding out in the sand. But she hesitated. The wound of his dismissal was fresh. Julian saw the hesitation. He knew words weren't enough. He needed to show her. Slowly, deliberately, Julian unbuttoned the wet cuff of his left sleeve. He rolled up the soaking fabric of his dress shirt, past the gold watch, past the elbow. He held his arm out. There, on the inside of his forearm, faded and jagged, was a brand. It wasn't ink. It was a burn scar, crude and old, shaped into a specific insignia. The diamond of the 1st Marine Division, with a jagged line running through it, the mark of the survivors of the Fallujah ambush. "I didn't just watch the news in 2004, Julian whispered. "I was in the Blackwater district. My Humvee took an RPG. I was trapped in the wreckage for 6 hours. I listened to my radio operator die calling for help. Your unit. Phantom Fury. You were the ones who answered the call. You cut us out." Sarah stared at the scar. She reached out, her fingers trembling, and traced the raised skin. The contact was electric. It bridged the gap between the billionaire and the nurse, stripping away the titles until they were just two soldiers standing in the rain. "I was broken when I came home," Julian confessed, tears mixing with the rain on his face. "So I built a fortress of money, so nothing could ever hurt me again. But I locked my son inside with me. I need you to help me break him out, Sarah. I need you to lead the extraction team, please." Sarah looked up, her hazel eyes glistening. The hardness melted away, replaced by the resolve of a medic who sees a patient bleeding out. "We don't leave men behind," she said softly. She grabbed her duffel bag from the ground. "Let's move. We're burning daylight." The drive back to the estate was a blur of speed and silent understanding. When the Land Rover screeched to a halt in front of the mansion, Sarah didn't wait for the door to be opened. She was out and running before the engine died. Inside, the house was a cacophony of panic. The agency nurse was weeping in the hallway. Dr. Roberts was on the phone, shouting orders. Sarah burst into Leo's room like a shockwave. The boy was pale, his breathing shallow and rattling. The monitors were screaming high-pitched warnings. "Clear the AO!" Sarah barked. The authority in her voice was absolute. The agency nurse jumped back. Dr. Roberts spun around, about to protest, but Julian stepped into the doorway, filling the frame. "Let her work," Julian ordered. He wasn't asking. Sarah moved to the bed. She didn't look at the machines. She looked at the boy. She placed her warm, calloused hands on his cheeks. "Cadet Sterling," she said, her voice sharp and commanding, cutting through the haze of fever. "Eyes on me! That is a direct order!" Leo's eyelids fluttered. He groaned, thrashing weakly. "Doc?" "I'm here, Leo. I'm right here," Sarah said, her voice softening instantly into a lullaby of reassurance. "Mission isn't over, kid. We have Lego to build. We have pancakes to burn. You are not authorized to check out. Do you copy?" Leo let out a long, shuddering breath. His eyes opened, glassy and tired, but focused. He saw her face. He saw the skull tattoo on her arm as she brushed the hair from his forehead. "Copy," Leo whispered. "Dad is here too," Sarah said, grabbing Julian's hand and pulling him to the bedside. She placed Julian's hand on Leo's chest, right over his heart. "We're a fire team now. 3-man unit. Nobody fights alone." Julian fell to his knees beside the bed, sobbing openly, clutching his son's hand. He felt the heat of the fever, but he also felt the steadying rhythm of the heartbeat slowing down, calming, sinking with the presence of the woman who had brought peace back into their war zone. Sarah didn't leave that night. She sat in the chair, watching the monitors. Julian sat on the floor, his back against the wall, watching her. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The perimeter was secure. Epilogue. 1 year later. The summer sun was golden and warm, bathing the backyard of the Sterling estate in a light that felt forgiving. The silence of the mausoleum was gone, replaced by the sizzle of a grill and the shrieks of a happy child. Leo was running across the lawn, chasing a golden retriever puppy. He wasn't pale. He wasn't wheezing. He was tanned, scraped-kneed, and loud. "Careful on the turn, cadet," Sarah called out from the patio. She was wearing a sundress, something soft and yellow that she never would have worn a year ago. Her hair was down, loose and wavy. Julian stood at the grill, flipping burgers. He wasn't wearing a suit. He was wearing jeans and a black t-shirt that revealed his arms. He looked younger, the deep lines of stress around his eyes smoothed out by a year of actual living. He looked over at Sarah. She was laughing at something Leo did. The sound of her laugh was the best return on investment he had ever made. He walked over to her, wiping his hands on a towel. He stood behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "He looks good," Julian murmured. "He looks like a survivor," Sarah corrected, leaning back into him. "Just like his old man." Julian turned her around. He looked at her face, tracing the faint scar on her eyebrow with his thumb. He reached into his pocket. This time there was no hesitation. No contracts. No prenups. He didn't pull out a ring yet. He pulled out a piece of paper. It was an adoption form. I talked to the lawyers, Julian said softly. It's official. If you sign this, legally, you're his mother. You're not the nurse anymore, Sarah. You're the parent. Equal rights. Equal say. Sarah stared at the paper. Her eyes filled with tears. She had spent her life saving people and then letting them go. She had never been asked to stay forever. And, Julian added, his voice trembling slightly, once you sign that, I have another question to ask you. About us. Sarah looked from the paper to Leo, who was waving at them from the grass, and then back to Julian. She didn't need to read the fine print. She took the pen from his pocket. She signed her name with a flourish, right below his. Mission accepted, she whispered. Julian smiled, a true, unburdened smile. He took her hand in his. As he squeezed it, the scars on his arm aligned with the ink on hers, the skull and the diamond, the pain and the healing. They stood together, watching their son run in the sunlight, no longer ghosts haunting a mansion, but a family built on the only thing stronger than war. Love. The end.